Hello, I'm Bradley Verdell. You are watching Authors Recommend Books. With me again is the impeccable Mark Will, author and poet. Yeah, impeccable. There were so many adjectives that went through my mind. I could have said
and that's the one you decided.
Eminent, yeah, something like that. Right. So this is a show where we, two self-published authors, are going to recommend books that we like for our people who follow us. Mark, how can people help us out?
Well, they can buy our books.
That's right. You can buy our books. If you like this channel and you like the book recommendations that we give every week, you can go on Amazon and buy our books. I write, I guess it could be called steampunk or fantasy. It's basically Victorian era fantasy. That's what I would call it. It's fantasy set after an industrial revolution. And of course it's fantastic. What do you write?
Everything. I try my hand at everything. Poetry, prose.
You're not stuck in a genre.
No,
right?
no. But
Jack of all trades right here.
You better believe it. But at the present time, I'm pimping my book, Of Letters and a Man, A. It's the first part of a projected 26-part epic poem in blank verse. So fans of Milton and other epic poets will love it. That's guaranteed. All
right. Get it. Yeah, that's the only way you can help us out. Otherwise, we don't take any money for our recommendations, right? We're recommending these books because we're writers, so we read a lot. That's a great way to improve your writing, is to read, and these are books that we just like and recommend. I think last time I recommended a book by a dead guy, so I didn't get any money from that. This channel is not monetized. These are not sponsored. They're just things that we like. All right, so again, we're hitting you up with a non-fiction recommendation first, and then a fiction recommendation. My book this week is How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. It's a history book, obviously, about the Victorian age. So I think people who...
Threat has been detected.
Oh, we got our background noise again. I think people who like my books and like the historical component of it, this would be a great book to read if you're just interested in how people lived in the Victorian era. What do you think about the Victorians?
I prefer the Romantics.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why's that?
Well, I'll take Byron, Shelley, and Blake over Browning, Tennyson, and Matthew Arnold.
Okay.
Any day of the week.
Fair enough. Personal preference. I would go with the Victorians on that count. But it's not about the... the book actually doesn't go into the artistic, literary type achievements of the age. It's very practical, which is why I like it. If you want to know kind of how people lived in their daily lives in that time period, this is the book for you. So what I wanted to start out with, though, is the author. I've been following this author for a long time. Her name is Ruth Goodman, and she's, I guess, super famous. She is, well, let me just give you a little bit about her. She was a consultant in the movie Shakespeare in Love. She's been given an honorary degree. I think it might be an honorary doctorate, actually, for her contribution to history. She's been on so many BBC shows where they do living history, where they reenact, sort of like reenactment, but living in the lifestyle to try to figure out how things were done. She was on the Victorian Farm, Victorian Pharmacy, Edwardian Farm, all of which I watched, Tudor Monastery Farm, which was really good, by the way, and Wartime Farm. So
these are all BBC productions?
Yeah,
okay. And
they're fantastic. And it's Ruth Goodman and some other historians, and in one case, like for the Victorian Pharmacy, they got like a modern pharmacist to also, go through it, and they live that lifestyle for long periods of time. She has gone 4 months without washing with water. She's operated all sorts of scary Victorian machinery, and basically followed instructions from that time period and sort of pieced together how the most logical way to do things.
How do you survive that? No water?
Yeah, well, let's get right to it then. Yeah, the Victorians didn't really bathe every day, right? With water. That wasn't the way
See,
they did it.
another reason to prefer the Romantics.
Yeah. They did a stand-up wash. And I remember, this was interesting for me to read about, because in my great aunt's house, she had a Victorian wash basin. You've seen the bowl and the pitcher and the slop pail.
Yes.
And that's how they took a shower. Basically, all you need is you need a flannel, you need some soap, you need a slop pail, a bowl, and hot water. And you basically do a stand-up wash, and you could actually do it with your clothes on, because it's so cold, right? So you could roll up a sleeve and do one arm and do the other arm, and then wash yourself part at a time. But yeah, that was the standard Victorian washing experience. No matter how rich you were or how poor you were, you're doing a stand-up wash at a wash basin.
Okay.
Yeah. So she basically, the reason I like this book is she starts out from waking up in the morning. Oh, and the last thing about Ruth Goodman's, I would just say, she's probably considered like the expert on British domestic life from the Tudor era on up to Edwardian times, I would say. She really focuses on normal people, not biographies of rich, famous, important people, right?
So Victorians.
Yeah, that's right. This is the everyman's experience. So she talks about, the book starts with waking up and goes to after the bedroom door is closed at night, and she walks you through the day, and each section is broken down into breakfast, and then the work of the day, and for kids there was school and this and that, and she talks about how it changed through the era. So
a day in the life.
Yeah, a day in the life, exactly. And one of the things that was really interesting is, have you ever heard of a knocker-upper?
Maybe, but I'm guessing it's not. It doesn't have the same meaning.
Not what you think it is. That's right. May not be. So she starts out with, you may have awoken to a tap at your window, because at the beginning of the Victorian era, a lot of people didn't have clocks or watches, right? But you may have gotten a factory job, and you need to be there at a certain time. So you would pay this guy, the knocker-upper, a penny a month, and he would have invested in a watch. And his job is to go around with a long pole and tap on your window until you wake up. And he would go through the town and wake up all the factory workers.
It's a wake-up service.
Yeah, wake-up call, yeah. So if you had the money, you were willing to invest in a watch, that could be your job. And then she talks about...
Then you could go to sleep after that.
Yeah, that's right. And you come back in the afternoon and sleep. Yeah, and then she goes through, how you would clean yourself up in the morning and stuff like that. But yeah, fascinating book. Just fascinating book, full of interesting facts. I mean, I could talk about it for a long time, but I'm going to try to be brief. She even gives you cosmetic recipes, and part of the book reads like a potion manual. I'll give you a taste of that. She says, recipe for American tooth powder, and what we mean here is toothpaste, because obviously they didn't have commercial toothpaste. A lot of people use soot. You can brush your teeth with soot, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, people could go to the pharmacist and or chemist, as it would have been called, I suppose, and mix your own American tooth powder. It calls for coral, cuttlefish bone, dragon's blood, of each 8 drachms, burnt alum and red sanders 4 drachms, orris roots 8 drachms, cloves and cinnamon half, rose pink 8 drachms, powder and mix. So, there's these recipes for cosmetics, just shaving cream and all kinds of stuff, and that's in here. And she's made this stuff. That's the amazing thing, is that the author has lived this lifestyle, and she's experimented with all this stuff. I mean, there's a few things, like one recipe calls for bear fat, which obviously you can't get nowadays. But, she substitutes things for chemicals that would have been too dangerous, or, just can't get a hold of them.
Did you try any of her recipes?
I have not yet, no. Although I could probably go... For those of you who are watching for the first time, we are both expats living in Taipei, Taiwan. I could probably go to a Chinese medicine shop and get all sorts of interesting stuff here. But the few facts that surprised me, it's interesting to think that Victorian soap was so expensive. A 4 ounces of soap would cost you as much as a good joint of beef. So you're giving up a really good meal at a time when a lot of people couldn't afford to eat meat very often, just for soap. So that's interesting. She, as I said, she's gone 4 months without washing with water, and she talks about one thing is you're wearing so many clothes because it's so cold and there's no heating. Buildings are poorly insulated. Fuel is expensive, so you're basically cold all the time, and you just wear layers and layers and layers. And she goes into lots of detail about the clothing that they wore, and like the Western business suit that everybody wears now is nothing like the business suit of the Victorian era, because she said if you've ever handled like a World War II greatcoat, like that kind of thick, incredibly tightly woven kind of material, that is like your sport coat of the Victorian era. I mean, they were dressing for warmth, not fashion.
A heavy wool coat.
Yeah, super heavy wool. And she said, these things are like basically waterproof because water stands on the surface and will basically dry off before it can get wet enough to soak through, unless you're just in a downpour for a long period of time. But she goes into a lot of detail about how clothing's made. But she says it's important to change your underwear often. That was one way that they stayed clean. You basically wear an underlayer that's easy to wash, white, that's easy to wash, and then you don't have to, and that carries the dirt away from your body. You can also use you can just rub your skin with a linen towel until you get a healthy pink glow. Or you could use something called a flesh brush, which is just suede leather on a wooden brush. And she said she's done this and nobody could tell that she wasn't showering. She said a lot of historians like to think that the Victorians just smelled awful all the time. But she says living that way, she really doubts that that's the case. People just wouldn't have stunk all the time.
What'd she do for deodorant?
Yeah, I don't remember that part of the book, but there is a section on deodorant. And also, I think, colognes and perfumes were big business. Yeah. In that, and that's also a lot for your clothes because laundry is such a pain. The book that I'm coming out with soon, The Fourth Warlock, the main character starts out as a laundress in essentially the Victorian era, and I got a lot of my research done by reading this book about how laundry was done and how incredibly tedious and awful it was. And she says, if you're a housewife in the Victorian era and you were very poor, you're doing everything yourself. But as you gained wealth, if there's one thing a housewife would like to pay someone else to do, it's laundry. Yeah. Laundry is just such a process because
that's the case now too.
Yeah, probably. And she talks. Ruth Goodman talks about how I think something that you always come across in the Victorian era is that the bicycle is a huge in the liberation of women because it's when women basically started needing to wear pants. So it becomes a necessity that if a woman needs to travel to work, a good cheap way to do it is by bicycle, and therefore women started to wear pants. But she talks about how awful laundry was, and how there's a lot of accounts of tempers flaring up during laundry when the women of the house are doing it. And steam-powered washing drums were a huge liberator of women. Once the washing machine as a technology has done more for the liberation of women than a whole lot of other technologies.
This is her thesis?
Yeah. That's so much of what tied up women was things like that. Another interesting thing she talks about is sewing. Basically, in any kind of needlework and working with cloth, basically everybody knew how to do it. She said it's instructions on how to sew are conspicuous by their absence. The writers, like if you're reading, manuals and housekeeping books from the Victorian era, they just assume you know everything there is to know about stitching and sewing and, crochet or knitting or whatever all that stuff is. And I see that a lot when I read, for example, like survival books from that period or sort of outdoor how-to kind of books. They'll go into lengthy detail about how to build a log cabin or how to do other things that they assume their reader wouldn't know how to do. But they always assume you know how to do every kind of stitch and sewing operation. It was just constant. It was like women never had a spare moment from working with cloth. But it's not all fun and games. In my books, I try to make the Victorian era awesome. I focus on the good and don't go into all the detail of the bad. But like there's lengthy information about hunger and child labor and violation, worker exploitation and all that stuff. And it's really heartbreaking.
Well, it's in Dickens.
Yeah, exactly. Like she talks about, one boy writes in his memoir from that period, I think when he was 6 years old, he does his first farm work. I mean, in many ways the Industrial Revolution got people, a lot of this stuff, a lot of the misery of child labor that was always how it was throughout all of human history. Children become farm laborers immediately, and later on, a lot of them were able to make money because of industrialization that made their lives better. And she gives a pretty even-handed look at the period. But, imagine a boy 6 years old, his first job on the farm is to scare crows because the field has been plowed, seed has been put there. They don't want the crows to come by and steal the seed. So he's given a pile of rocks and he's standing out in the field from before dawn to after dusk. And he doesn't eat all day.
Wow. And
he's alone. He has no one to talk to. He's in the cold, doesn't get any food. And the memory is like they never left people. As an adult, these people are talking about, I can't, they write in their diaries and memoirs, I can't explain to you how awful that was. These memories just, haunted people for the rest of their lives. She talks about... she talks about hunger. Here's an interesting fact from the book. Victorians were about, I wrote it down, 3 or 3.5 inches, I believe, shorter than modern Londoners. And they were, I think, 2 inches shorter than their medieval counterparts, all because of hunger. So you can imagine the amount
2 inches shorter?
Yeah.
Than people from medieval times.
That's right.
Wow.
Yeah, and then a lot of that's because of the potato famine and things like that. But then, modern Britons are, 3.5 inches taller, or an inch taller than medieval.
Because of their potatoes and roast beef.
Yeah. And but even at the time, the difference in hunger, you could see it within the era. So if you took somebody from the East End of London, they would be on the I think it comes from prison records or something like that. It would be, on average, 4 inches shorter than an upper-class Etonian.
Wow. Within
the period, yeah. Okay. So hunger is a huge issue. And she goes a lot into the food they ate. She talks about, the common breakfast for Victorians, depending on it varies a lot depending on what part of the country you're in, but bread and beer, that's your breakfast. Might have been oatmeal and beer.
Have you ever thought about including some of these less savory aspects of the Victorian period in your work?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think I will. It's not so much in the Chadwick Yates series, but I'm, it's something I'm working on now. I'm dwelling on that more. Yeah, I think it is. I've heard Ruth Goodman say, what would you say to these people? Or maybe it was in this book. I've read a lot of her work, so I'm not sure if it's in this book, but she says, if I could talk to the people whose lives I'm reading about, I would just say thank you. She looks back on the hardships of that period and thinks, children working in mines 12 hours a day and all this hunger and people bearing through the cold and all this stuff. It was miserable and horrible, but they opened up all the technologies that make our lives so much materially better than that. They had such, and she says, you can really see people were so devoted to their families and really struggling and were willing to sacrifice to try to improve their lives and the lives of their family members and people around them. A lot of boys who went to work at age 11 or 12, if they got a railroad job or a mining job, they could be out earning their fathers by the time they were 15 or 16 years old. And they felt proud to bring a wage home to their mothers. They felt like they were a real man and earning their keep. And they also got a little more food. A lot of families, if all you had was, bread, potatoes, maybe some pottage or something like that, if there was a piece of bacon to spare, it would go to the wage-earning man or the wage-earning son. So, the men are getting the slightly better food that every now and then can be afforded at this time period. Yeah, but it's a fantastic book. I mean, as far as writing historical fiction, it's a must-read. If anybody wants to write in the Victorian era, or they like to read sort of steampunk type literature, and you want to know what it was really like back then, I would say start with this book.
It's a great source book.
It is a fantastic source book. Yeah, I think there's a book that J.R.R. Martin, is that right? J.R.R. Martin? No, what's his name?
George
R.R. Martin. G.R.R. Martin used a nonfiction book that's since become famous for his source book about what it was like living in a medieval city. I believe the book is called Life in a Medieval City, and it goes through the cooking and the food and all that. This is the source book for a writer who wants to write Victorian fiction. I mean, for the upper class stuff, there's so much more information on what the king and queen ate at their banquets. All that stuff is very well written down, but you have to dig to find what it was like for the average person. I just mentioned one other thing. I mean, there are too many amazing facts to mention, but one of the things that amazed me is how children were given really dangerous, like opiate-based drugs. Like there were things called, I'm trying to find what the name of one of these drugs was. Yeah, like Godfrey's cordial, and a lot of medicine. It was a lot of quackery, right? Dalby's calmative. A lot of these medicines. Can you imagine you're a mother and you've got to work all day and you've got children to take care of, and they're crying and they're kind of in the way, so you give them a calmative to basically drug them so they just sleep all day, just knock them out. But a lot of these drugs, they were advertised as all natural, all herbal, completely safe, but they were based on, opiates and dangerous drugs. And the dangerous drugs often settled at the bottom. So one thing she noticed is, if you didn't shake the bottle, the last dose could be lethal.
Oh, wow.
So if you imagine that, you give your baby an overdose and it dies because of a medicine that you were sold that was falsely advertised. That's another. So if you want to look at the ups and the downs of the Victorian era, what some really cool things, like railroads and steam engines and all that, and also some really, really dark, difficult times. This is a 5-star book for you. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Ruth Goodman, fantastic. I will continue to follow her work. Read several of her books and love her documentaries. And maybe when I become super famous, I can get an interview with her. What do you got for us today?
Well, I've got the work of another canonical author.
Oh, remind us.
Do you remember what that means?
I remember what it means, but our listeners may not remember what it means.
When I talk about a canon or a canonical author, I'm talking about my own personal canon. So this author, the South African author J.M. Coetzee, is, for me, a canonical author, and that just means he is a literary master for me personally. So he's kind of a teacher or role model, and I want to read all of his works.
Right, that's what I was going to say. Canonical for you is got to finish everything.
I'm a completionist.
Right.
So if I find a writer that I feel is canonical, I'm going to read all of his or her works. And so, yeah, he recently entered my personal canon. The book I'm going to talk about today is Diary of a Bad Year. But let me just back up and briefly tell you about my experience with my reading experience with Mr. J.M. Coetzee. And I know that's how his name is pronounced because I asked a South African here in Taiwan, and it was confirmed. It is Coetzee, Coetzee.
Oh, that's the thing about reading, right? This is something that doing YouTube has taught me. All these things that I know what the word looks like, but I never bother to learn how to pronounce it. Now the onus is on to get it right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well,
how did you discover this author?
Well, I first read a book of his called The Master of Petersburg, which is a novel based on the life of the Russian author Dostoevsky.
Oh, yeah.
And I love Dostoevsky, so a friend recommended this many years ago. And I read it, and it was good, but not great. And so I never really felt compelled to read more Coetzee. But a few years ago, someone recommended his novel Disgrace, and there's actually a movie version. I think I watched the movie first. It's with John Malkovich.
Oh,
and
great actor.
Yeah, and it's a very good movie, but then I wanted to read the book, and that was fantastic. Then maybe a year after that, I read Waiting for the Barbarians, which is one of the best books I've ever read. That's
saying a lot.
That is phenomenal. So that, I think probably it was reading Waiting for the Barbarians that made me realize, okay, this guy is the real deal. I mean, he is definitely canonical for me. I want to read everything he's written. So I'm still making my way through all his books, but
is he still alive?
He is.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a Nobel laureate. He won the Nobel, I don't know, several years ago. Maybe now it's been 10 or more, but he's achieved international renown. I knew that before, but I wasn't interested. It's not about how many awards a writer has. It's like, what do they do for you as a reader?
That's
like
right.
what connection do you have to this author as a reader? And for me, reading Disgrace and then later Waiting for the Barbarians, it's like, yep, he's in the club.
Yeah. Okay, come bring it on.
Yeah. For what it's worth, he's in my personal canon. So, that brings us to Diary of a Bad Year. And
wait, before you say it, this author, since you've read several things, would an author still be canonical for you if all their books are very, very different?
Well, for me, that's always a good thing.
Okay.
I think in the last episode I was talking about Garcia Marquez, who is also for me canonical, but the quality is uneven. Like,
right.
You've got 100 Years of Solitude, Love in the Time of Cholera, The Autumn of the Patriarch. Those are 5-star masterpieces.
Yeah.
But then you've got The General and His Labyrinth. What were the others I mentioned? No One Writes to the Colonel. Mm-hmm. Those are not of the same caliber, but I still benefit from reading them. It's still interesting because I love Garcia Marquez so much. So I guess once they're in my personal club, once they're in the canon, once they've become like literary masters to me, I'm still going to read as much of their work as I can, even if it's of uneven quality.
But I mean, the subject matter, that they take on. Because I would say, like, for me, H. Rider Haggard is definitely canonical for me. But his books are, you get the same experience. You know, it's a variation, but there's a predictable. Same with Jules Verne. I mean, he writes about different subjects, but there is a Jules Verne experience that is consistent. Where if you want more, you know, his book is going to give you that feeling. But some authors write completely different things, right?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say that there's a consistency of tone maybe throughout. If we're talking specifically about Coetzee, I mean, he's got a distinctive, very authoritative tone or voice or style or whatever you want to say, but his works are not necessarily all the same. In fact, this particular book that I'm talking about today, Diary of a Bad Year, is, to use the term that I introduced last week, sui generis or sui generis.
What does that mean?
Well, it's a Latin phrase. It means literally of its own genre or of its own type or in a class by itself, if you will. And I'm attracted to works like this. The Autumn of the Patriarch, which I discussed in episode 3, that is a sui generis book. And the Diary of a Bad Year definitely is too. Now, I believe that there's nothing new under the sun.
King Solomon.
All literary tricks have been tried at one time or another, but it is possible to combine those tricks in new and innovative ways. And I think that is what Coetzee achieves in Diary of a Bad Year. So how does he do that? There are basically 3 narratives in this book. So the main part of the book, I guess you could say, is a collection of essays, or actually 2 collections of essays, in the manner of Montaigne. So it's you could just read the essays and it would be a great book, you know. But in addition to the essays, there is a section at the bottom of not every page, but most pages. There's a section at the bottom which is the author's commentary on the essays. So the essays are written not by Coetzee, but by J.C., who is, J.M. Coetzee's alter ego, right?
Right.
So it's still a fictional creation, but the essays in themselves are fantastic, right? But then below that, you've got J.C. commenting on his life as it's like a running commentary, which is not necessarily connected to the essays, right?
That's an interesting
but
trick.
he's talking about his life during the time of composition, right? Okay, so that's the second narrative, or maybe that's the diary referenced in Diary of a Bad Year. But then, not at the beginning, but a few pages in, you get a third narrative that starts. And so on each page, you've got the essays at the top, in the middle, the author's commentary, and then below that, in a third section, is a female character's commentary. A female that he interacts with. He actually hires her to type his handwritten notes, and that becomes the book, right?
I see.
And so you've got 3 different narratives all on one page,
nested.
Sometimes, I mean, it's some the alternative, the second two narratives, let's say narratives 2 and 3, sometimes they drop out, right? And then you're just reading a page with essays. But so what makes this sui generis?
Yeah.
How do you read it? Right? Like, do you read it page by page? Like, you go essay, and then narrative 2, the author's commentary, narrative 3, the female character's commentary, or do you just read one continuous narrative at a time? Read all the essays, then go back, read the author's commentary, then go back and read the female character's commentary. I found myself doing a little bit of both, right? Like, sometimes the secondary or tertiary narrative was so engrossing that I just kept reading. It's like I couldn't stop, you know?
So if the first one, maybe you feel like, oh, okay, I can stop right here and catch up with it, and then that carries you over, and then you got to go back and catch up. Oh, that's really interesting.
So it's a fascinating composition, and it's a challenge to read, and it's an adventure to read, and so I love works like this which challenge the reader, and then they raise questions like, what is literature? What is a book? What is a text? Where does the text end? Is it just the pages between the covers of this paperback or hardcover book? So of course there's also the connection with the biographical J.M. Coetzee, because J.C., the primary narrator and the author of the essays in the book, he's obviously based on the world-renowned Nobel Prize-winning South African expatriate author J.M. Coetzee. I mean, he's J.C., right?
Yeah.
But he's also not J.M. Coetzee. It's a fictional creation. So, for example, J.C. in the novel is, I think, 72 when Coetzee wrote it. 10 years ago. He wasn't 72, so it's a fictionalized version of his author's persona or whatever, right?
I see.
So,
well, that you were saying, what is a book? That just made me think, like, oh, now somebody's going to get the idea at some point to do an ebook where, like, there are links in the book that take you to, like, websites, and is that part of the book as well? Like, if it's a trick, like if it's part of a fictional narrative, it's like, okay, that would be kind of mind blowing.
Some people have already started doing that.
Yeah.
There's an American author, Robert Coover, I think his name is. He's experimented with that some, and so I'm all in favor of that kind of experimentation. Okay. Let me just discuss the three characters, because there's a triangle relationship in here. So there's J.C., the author, and then there is a sexy young 29-year-old Filipina girl that lives in his apartment complex. She's the author of the third narrative, right?
Okay.
He hires her to transcribe his handwritten notes, and that will be the basis for the manuscript that he submits to his publisher. Okay. Now, Anya lives with a 42-year-old man named Alan, and Alan is extremely jealous of the relationship that his live-in girlfriend has with this elderly author. And,
I see.
And so he wants to know why she's spending so much time with him transcribing his notes. Is it just for money? Is he trying to touch you? And so at one point Anya says, this is her impression of what's going on: the old bull and the young bull fighting it out, and me, I am the young cow they are trying to impress, that is getting bored with their antics. So anyway, Anya, he calls her la secretaria, the secretary, right? And then
Yeah.
she says or he says he's or she's his secret aria, secretarius.
Yeah.
Secretary, secret aria. And so she's kind of like his muse.
Yeah.
She becomes his muse. And so you don't really know, did he really need someone to type this manuscript, or was he just attracted to her and, was he looking for inspiration, a muse or whatever?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's always good to have a reader, if somebody's typing your notes.
Well,
then
that's
you're
true.
writing for an audience.
That's true. But, the character of Alan, the 42-year-old, he's a rather shady financial planner or stockbroker or something. He does something pretty reprehensible, which I won't disclose. No spoilers. You have to read it.
Well, this won't be a spoiler, but what's the setting?
It's Australia.
Okay.
So,
right.
and see, that's another autobiographical element, because Coetzee he left South Africa long ago, and he's lived in Australia as an expat for years.
Okay.
And so
that explains the mix of people.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so JC is also a South African expat who is a famous writer living in Australia, right?
Yeah.
And so Anya is the 29-year-old Filipina, very sexy, and she's quite conscious of her allure and appeal.
She knows she's got it, right?
At one point, she says that she waggled her bum to, attract him. I don't know if it was to attract his attention, but to let him know that she knew he was looking at her, something like that. Yeah. And Alan is the 42-year-old Australian guy, and he, of course, despises JC, or Senor C, as Anya calls him, considers him a dreamer and a schemer. And there is I alluded to the Battle of the Bulls. There's a literal confrontation that takes place towards the end of the book, and it gets pretty ugly. This guy Alan attacks JC.
72-year-old.
Yeah,
JC.
not physically, but insults him in his own home.
I see.
Calls him a dreamer and a schemer. And Anya's reaction is, well, I finally saw him for what he was: a surly, dissatisfied, half-drunk, middle-aged white Australian. But anyway, so you've got the essays, you've got the author's commentary on the essays, you've got Anya's commentary on what's going on. So it's a great example of what the Russian critic Bakhtin, I mentioned him last time, would call heteroglossia.
Okay.
Remember
what is
that phrase. #heteroglossia.
Heteroglossia, you might have to spell that for us.
Well,
for the hashtag, but what
hetero,
is it?
Hetero, different, right? Glossia, GLOSSIA, has to do with speaking, right?
Yeah.
So it's basically polyphony. It's Bakhtin also talks about the dialogic imagination. Like every great novel has a multitude of voices. It's not just one narrative voice, but you've got like a polyphony of different voices and viewpoints.
Yeah.
And so that's there's no like one dominant voice. You've got the essays, that's like the main part of the book, but in a way it's undercut by the author's commentary, and then that's undercut by Anya's commentary. So which one is authoritative? They all are in different ways. So it's like it's polyphony. It's like music. It's a celebration of heteroglossic voices.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, that just made me think, when one of the tricks of trying to write fiction is making each character sound like a different person, right? And that's something where that's something that in my newer novel, The Fourth Warlock, I tried really, really hard to get that right, and that was something that several people who kind of beta read it or edited said, "Oh yeah, all these characters sound like very different people.
Distinct.
They have a different voice." But that's a very, one person writing it, and you're writing the essays, the notes, and the notes, three, like you said, 3 strands, trying to make those sound like very different people. That's so it's not just, because normally in like third person omniscient, you have sort of the narrator's voice, and then each character needs to have a different voice. But yeah, that's an interesting way to do it as well.
Yeah.
Making them sound different.
Well, I'll just close by explaining something else about the structure of the book. So the first section of essays is called Strong Opinions, and so he, in his conversation with Anya, JC says, "These are dark times. You can't expect me to write about them in a light manner," because she had criticized him as she was typing up his notes. She said, "You sound so dogmatic. It's like you're on a soapbox and you're preaching to people. It's a bit off-putting." So, in this section we've got essays like On the Origins of the State, on anarchism, on Machiavelli, on terrorism, on pedophilia, on the slaughter of animals, and so on. So
it's getting into very political, hot topics.
Very controversial, heavy, serious.
Heavy, that's the word. Yeah.
Serious topics, right? Strong opinions.
Yeah.
But then in the second section, it seems to be due to Anya's influence, right? So here's an example of the typist actually influencing the output of the writer of the text, So perhaps to appease her, or after, as a response to her criticisms of the first collection of essays, he writes what he calls second diary, which he describes as a gentler set of opinions. And Anya calls them his soft opinions instead of his strong opinions.
Right, she softens him. Yeah.
Right. And so here we've got more whimsical essays like on fan mail, on the erotic life, on aging, on the writing life, on the mother tongue, on being photographed, on the birds of the air, on boredom, on J.S. Bach. So just a random... It's just like a
more
random...
More lighthearted, happy topics.
Yeah. I mean, he still deals with serious issues, but there's a different tone in the second set of essays. So, 5 stars all the way. It's a sui generis masterpiece.
The title, my last question will be this. The title would lead me to believe, if I saw it and I knew nothing about that, I would say, oh, that's going to be depressing to read. Do you get
a bad year?
Yeah. What's the mood overall? Like, as you're reading it, is it an upper or a downer, or,
It's a bit of both, I guess I would say. I mean, it ends, I won't tell you exactly how it ends, but it ends on a note of hopefulness, I guess.
Okay.
I mean, it's not as though JC and Anya hook up and live happily ever after, no. But they do have a sort of special spiritual connection, I guess.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's interesting. We didn't plan this, but I would say the same thing about How to Be a Victorian. It's a mix of uppers and downers. You read some of it, you're like, that is so cool. And then you read other parts, and you're like, oh, I'm so glad I live in the year 2018,
Right.
But it ends on a note of hopefulness.
Yeah.
So there we go.
Okay.
So 5 stars?
Definitely.
Yep. Okay.
Yes.
That's great. All right. Well, the links to these books will be in the description of the video, as well as in the description you can find how to find Mark and his books, where to find me on Twitter, Facebook. All our links and connections are below. Again, if you want to help us out, consider reading our books. And we hope you like these recommendations. We'll be back at you with more in our next episode. I'm trying to release roughly a video a week. We've been doing a video a week so far, so hopefully we'll keep it up.